guest speaker series. My name is Christian Reisler, and I'm a museum specialist here at Frontier Army Museum. And tonight, we welcome Mr. Florian Viral. He is going to be sharing with us his research into the Punitive expedition and some different things that he has studied and found over the years. I won't go too much into his resume because that will be part of his presentation this evening. But just know that he is the command historian for both the New Mexico National Guard and the U.S. Army Engineer School at Fort Leonard Wood. And so you will notice that we have artifacts and books and things up here. Most of the stuff is Florian's, but we do have two items from our collection. The first thing that we have here is a recruitment poster from Bangor, Maine, where the Army is advertising that they need 26,500 men for service along the U.S.-Mexico border for 9 different fields. And so they're looking, obviously, to fill a lot of positions for the expedition they're doing down there. And then we also have this Mexican Border Service medal, and it was given to both regular Army soldiers and National Guardsmen who served along the Mexican border basically between the spring of 1916 and the summer of 1917. So it's quite possible these 26,500 men, some of whom hail from the greater Bangor, Maine area, were awarded these medals after their service. So after the presentation is over, y'all are welcome to come up and take a look at these items. We just ask that you don't touch them. And a couple of other things too. We are leaving the museum and the various galleries open because we have a couple of exhibits that deal directly with what Mr. Vital was going to be talking about this evening. We have the Punitive Expedition Gallery in the very back. You just look for the biplane, you can't miss it. And we also have a Frontier Army Aviation exhibit in our Army Innovations hallway. So after the presentation and the Q&A, y'all are welcome to walk around the museum and check out the exhibits. Also, our gift shop is staying open later tonight, so y'all are welcome to go check that out as well. But with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Mr. Vital.
All right, thank you very much. Well, I want to welcome everybody here to the Frontier Army Museum. It is a pleasure to be here. Like she said, I am the command historian at the Army Engineer School down in Fort Leonard Wood, but I'm currently up here actually attending CGSC as an Army civilian. And then about 2 years ago was when I swore back into the Army National Guard, and this was down in New Mexico. So how the hell do I end up in New Mexico, right? And by the way, I live here in Platte City. So those are kind of things that we'll be talking about. We'll be talking about the Punitive expedition, but I'm also going to start talking about, what does sometimes an Army historian, what do they do? What is their job? And there, hopefully you will see that as an Army historian, they don't have to be boring. Because a lot of people think, yeah, they're down in the basement, or they might be just teaching at CGSC or some other fine establishment. Well, there's a whole bunch of stuff you can do. And there's part of the things that I'm going to show you of the things that we have done in regards to the Punitive expedition in Columbus, New Mexico, and the Punitive expedition itself. All right, history matters. And that's one of the things that I always end my presentations with and start them. For myself, I really use history as part of the leader development. That is why we use a lot of the staff rights and virtual staff rights. Who here knows what a staff right is? Quite a few, but it's, yeah, I hope so, back there. But there's quite a few people that actually don't know. So I always want to bring it up, and actually want to bring it up here in just a little bit of what that is. Mexican expedition or Mexican Punitive expedition. Why does that matter? Does it matter? What do you know about the Punitive expedition? And I'm very interactive. Usually I walk a lot and I ask a few questions. Yes?
Pat, you got into a gunfight?
You for sure did. Why else is it maybe important?
It was a response to violations of U.S. territorial sovereignty by Pancho Villa in the early Mexican Revolution.
All right. Yes?
Pointed out the vast deficiencies the Army had in moving
And those are all points that I start bringing up here just a little bit. And I will not just be doing all the talking, actually we'll give you some homework too. Or you can go and do some more research yourself. Yeah, but those are all points that are valid, and there's a few more that we found that are of importance that we should discuss. Also, when we start looking at the bigger picture, which is really the one that fascinates me. All right, Columbus, New Mexico. So we talked about Pancho Villa rate 9 March 1916, a small town which is about an hour west of El Paso, about a 16-hour drive from here. Not a very pleasant drive either. Pancho Villa rates this town. When you ask the people in Columbus itself, and here's actually a picture from around that time. It is right on Highway 9 and Highway 11, so 9/11. So we got Pancho Villa, a person that we once supported, I might add, before we did not like him too much more because we then suddenly supported the Carranza government in Mexico, because in Mexico there was a Mexican Revolution going on since 1910. So we got all kinds of turmoil down south. We support Pancho Villa. It is October of 1915, when we then now say, okay, the legitimate government of Mexico is actually Carranza. At this point, Pancho Villa is actually moving through the mountains towards Agua Prieta to actually go and fight the Carrancistas or the place. Loses badly, off he leaves to see what he can do next. Most of the time when we ask the people in Columbus though, or in just the regional area, they keep on talking about, well, he raided the place because of a merchant, which I'm going to go in just a little bit. So I told you before, I wanted to a little bit talk about staff right, and this is actually how I got interested in the subject. So back in 2015, I worked at the Combat Studies Institute, part of Army University Press. I was part of a staff right team over there, and that's when we decided to, hey, we will build a virtual staff right for the Punitive expedition. There's already been an actual ground staff right for the raid on Columbus, New Mexico, and that is being conducted all the time at the Sergeant Major's Academy, as well as several units conduct this kind of a staff right. But what is a staff right? Real quick, so some of the folks that don't know what it is, and if you ever worked with Combat Studies Institute or CGSC, you probably see those slides before. But it is professional development for U.S. Army leaders. It is kind of interesting. We'll be talking tonight mainly about the first Aero Squadron, and since I started looking into the subject more, I got more and more actual Air Force units that are interested in that subject as well, especially civil engineers. You're going to see a couple of slides what they really like about that. So it's professional development. That is really where I see myself as an Army historian, really utilizing history to improve the Army, to improve the soldiers, and really start a discussion of where we are going. One of the great examples that we worked on is the large-scale combat operations, a book set, which started back in 2018. And coming from a counterinsurgency environment, counterinsurgency mindset, how do we go forward? Well, let's start looking back to the history and see what we can gain, what kind of insights. And you're going to see some of those insights we can gain also from the Punitive expedition that I thought really important. That is why it really grabbed my attention. So anyways, we looked at leadership. There's a great thing about the Punitive expedition, and I'm going to go into just a little bit of what kind of leadership problems were involved. The terrain, everything's about the terrain and the staff right, or virtual staff right? Some people say it's a case study on steroids, but you have to be on the terrain. You have to see what the commander saw and what the decisions were made at that time of what he saw and what he knew. We showed a human dimension of battle, and you can see some of the other checklists over here. Some more logistical operations is another great one for the Punitive expedition, and really the timeless insights that we are after. has 3 different phases. Preliminary study phase, where we actually study the topic before we go out to the field, because once we go out to the field, it is very limited time, so we make sure we study that. Then we get the field phase, when we go out to the battlefield, we go to each one of the stands, that's just where we stop, and we have a discussion. We first do the orientation of what we see, what the commander saw, then the description of the battle or the decisions that were made at that point, and then some analysis already. And then at the end, which we can do later on that day or maybe the next day, we do the integration phase. And that is once again the most important part. It is not just a battlefield tour, what we do over there, it is about the integration phase. What did we learn? How can we combine it with our experience, and how can we look forward? And to really, once again, open the discussion really of where we're going in the future in regards to that. Virtual staff ride, first conducted back in 2005 here at CGSC. Combat Studies Institute develops that with a virtual battle state 3, and I just have a video up there. That is actually, like I said, I'm also part of the New Mexico National Guard, and we actually produced one virtual staff ride, which, by the way, you can fly through the terrain whichever way you want to, right? It is almost like a computer game, a first-person shooter game that you can fly through. So we actually built this terrain together with the Trader G2, so not with the Army University Press, and they built the terrain for us for free. As part of the Victoria Pass virtual staff, which was of course a battle just outside of Santa Fe. And hopefully we'll be able to do the same thing and also build a virtual staff fight, since it was never built by Army University Press for New Mexico, looking not just at Columbus but really looking at the Punitive expedition. So once again, you can just see, some of the terrain. Like I said, you can just fly right through and we see what the commander saw. We actually use that also at the New Mexico Military Museum. I'm part of the board on there as well, of really visualizing to the people of how the terrain looked back then. Many times we do virtual staff rides for areas where we can't go to. Well, guess what? Glorieta Pass, there's quite a few areas that have changed quite a bit. Just like Wilson's Creek. I always say Wilson's Creek just ain't Gettysburg. It really is. In Gettysburg, we have the tree lines where they used to be back then, and you get a good idea. Over here, not so much. Best example right here is Pigeons Ranch. You can see the open area, or open space right over here. Here you can see on the virtual terrain. Once we fly through, if you go there now, everything is forested. So you actually go through a little trail, and all you see is a bunch of trees. So why do we go there? Not really a way of conducting a staff ride. Alright, so let's keep on going. That is just for the future of kind of what we want to plan or what we want to do for the Punitive expedition. Alright, there we go. We have Pancho Villa. We already talked about the Mexican Revolution, kind of what's going on down south. So why did he raid Columbus? Many times we hear Sam Ravel. He's a merchant that is in Columbus itself. And the rumor goes he did not deliver on some weapons that Pancho Villa bought, or he delivered some bad ammunition. That is what everybody is saying down in Columbus. Once again, very regional, aspect of the history, and not really looking out far. And we're equipped to connect part of the exhibits that we have over here. You can see this campaign hat. Inside of there, we actually have this stamp, so Columbus Mercantile Company, Sam Ravel and Brothers. So that is actually from that store. So I was lucky enough to find it on eBay. It is probably from, I assume, the 24th Infantry. We don't know if it was from before the raid or after the raid. I would almost assume it was probably after the raid. But if you look at this infantry corps inside, and of course the Buffalo soldiers were down there too. So now we start, we have Patton, we have the Buffalo soldiers, we have, aviation. The story starts growing of how interesting it's really going to get. Hopefully that's what you agree with. So other reasons. So we talked about, yes, San Ravel, but what else is going on? I talked about Pancho Villa. We're losing. He was not very happy about the defeat. He, of course, loses a lot of his followers. I mean, he has a force of, I believe, close to 10,000 during the height of the war, which shrinks down to a few hundred after his battle in Agua Prieta. So how does he gain more people? Well, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So how can he get, once again, counterinsurgency thinking over here, as it's still a civil war going on, how you get more support, besides just going into the town and grabbing people too, of course that was going on as well. But he wants the involvement of the US, right? If he gets the US to come into Mexico, well, the people will not like that too much. And he's actually from Chihuahua, the northern part, so that was one thing that what he was hoping for. That is one of the reasons that might be the case of why he did the raid. Another one is World War I or the German involvement. Now it gets really interesting, right? Who has heard of that stuff before? A couple of people. There's 4 great books that are written by, I guess I consider my friend now, so I'm going to make some advertising for him. Also a German gentleman, Harry von Feilich. He actually lives in Virginia. And he takes a really closer look of the German involvement during the Mexican Revolution, during some of the operations that are going on in the United States itself in regards to the sabotage. And he really follows the money trail. Very interesting to say the least. Of every faction in the Mexican Revolution had some support or some kind of German spy. El Paso was just full of people that were trading guns, getting the guns down there, buying guns from North America, because if they're sold and being shipped down there, they're not going over to Europe, so on and so forth. Those are some of the reasons why else that might have been the case. And Felix Sommerfeld was actually, that's the German spy, he was actually deeply involved with Pancho Villa. All right, just to give you a quick overview. So we have March 9th, 1916, we have the raid, rather quickly, we have President Wilson, after the uproar of the entire country, we got to do something about Pancho Villa. So we see the Punitive expedition take place just a few days later. Of course we have Columbus right up here. This is where the movement starts going south. It will end up down Parral, which is I think about 400 miles all the way down into Mexico itself. The Punitive expedition itself lasts from March 15th, 1916 till the first week of February of 1917. Most actions occur in the beginning of it, of really, once again, now being the last cavalry campaign of the US Army that you can see, really riding, following Pancho Villa, trying to catch up with them, and not very successful. Most of the time when you look at history books, when it talks about the Punitive expedition, we didn't catch Pancho Villa, so how good was this whole thing anyways, the whole Punitive expedition? Well, there's I think a few more things that I think we can learn out of it that comes with it that will help us down the road. All right. So I told you 2015 is when we started working on a virtual staff, right? So we actually done the workbook, which tells the story of the Punitive expedition. So that was done. Unfortunately, we never made it into Mexico, I guess, for several reasons. I've been to a few places, but not all of them. But while studying this subject, some of the the insights and the things that really interested me, that really talked to me, I'm going to talk about right now. So the first thing is just the terrain. This is some of the terrain. You got wide open space, the wide open desert in the beginning when you start coming in, but then you start having a mountain ranges, the Sierra Madres, 10 to 12,000 feet high, but this is one of those pictures. Me as a historian, I always look at different case studies, and I jump sometimes from one subject to the next, or from one battle or war to the next, and I see all those different themes. I see things like, wow, this reminds me of this reminds me of this, and see some of those insights. This is actually the virtual terrain for the Battle of Wan at Kuna, Afghanistan. Almost looks the same, doesn't it? And that's the actual picture of how it looks like. So think about what the soldiers on the ground saw. So they saw very similar terrain from what our folks saw in Afghanistan compared to the guys in Mexico. Transportation. The U.S. Army at this point, at the beginning of the Punitive expedition, only had a handful of trucks and automobiles. They had to be acquired rather quickly in order to support logistically the forces that went all the way down into Mexico. And most of them went to Casas Grandes, and there's a couple of other, I guess, FOBs we can call them, where they had to push out. We were not able to utilize the trains because even though we said Carranza is the actual legitimate government or president of Mexico, well, he would not allow us to just come in. So now we are operating in an environment that we are not invited in, but we're looking for the one guy, and we have to support ourselves. So the problems, and it's, once again, the things we talk about during the staff ride or virtual staff rides, some of the insights of how do we get all the transportation, logistics, and there you go. There we are in Afghanistan, having the same kind of problems, going over the same kind of terrain. And Frontier Army faded away. That is one of the tablets of the exhibits talks about that. Hence, now we're connecting it to the museum. The Frontier Army, what we see of the way we conducted business before, and then going to the Punitive expedition, pouring into Mexico. You see the motorization. You see a good old Patton being on the first gunfight. By the way, he utilized a couple of Dodge cars that he then put some of the dead bodies on afterwards, which I guess later on qualified him to go out of the tank corps when he ends up in France during World War II, because he's the first American that utilized automobiles for an attack. Social cultural aspects. That is also something that our troops in Mexico back in 1916, of course, us in Afghanistan had a major problem, right? And here you can see two of those pictures are actually from Mexico, and if you're an 18, 19-year-old soldier and you haven't traveled too far, I mean, the one on the right pretty much looks the same. So those are the people, the culture you don't understand. How do you get the intelligence from those folks? There are so many parallels by going through and building this workbook or this case study that kept on coming up. A, out of my own experience, and B, just what you're reading. Here's the outside influences. You have Felix Sommerfeld with Francisco Madero. He actually tries to come back, by the way, to Mexico. He leaves in 1914 and 1915. He comes back to the United States, is in New York, supposed to go to San Francisco, but right here in Kansas City, he changes trains without anybody knowing, and down he goes to El Paso, but it is actually some, I believe, FBI agents that stop him because they want him back involved down there, and he actually dies in Fort Bliss. But anyways, outside influences, we talked about some of the German influence over there. Many times we talk about it similar on Telegram, but everything happened way before. We were much more active in regards to who they can support and what they can get out of it by being in Mexico itself. Now I want to connect that to the future too. This is actually part of a presentation I did in 2017, and I started talking about the influences, outside influences. At that point, 2016, 2017, I worked for Center for Army Lessons Learned. I was a military analyst, and we started looking at Russia at that time. I mean, right now it's like, yeah, no kidding. But guess what? In 2016, I kept on talking about a few of those points, and people were like, really? I don't think so. Well, it does happen with those outside influences of what's going on, of how Russia is doing information operations. How Russia was working in Syria in order to get migrants and so on and so forth up through Europe and really ending up here mainly in Germany because Poland just won't have it. Now you start looking of, well, what was that doing? Well, those kind of actions, second, third order effects, in Germany, nobody really cared about what was going on in regards to what Russia was doing. Well, Poland, not so much, because they just beat the Russians. But once again, you really see a lot of those parallels from history that you can just there. I mean, they didn't invent some of that stuff. Experiences and relationships, another great point. The experience, which I already talked about equivalent pattern, for examples, and all the experience from everybody else. This is for many of those soldiers really the first time of going to war. And the relationships they built, we will see later on, I mean, World War I, but they also go up to World War II, of the same kind of characters that formed that bond, that special bond, during combat and during a lot of off time, of course, in Mexico too, going forward. And here on the right-hand side, of course, you see a General Pershing, and you see a Benjamin Paul. All right. So now let's start moving more into the first Aero Squadron itself. Just really quick, if you don't know too much about the subject, the General and the Jaguar is probably one of the better books to read. If you want to look at somebody that actually was there, Chasing Via by Frank Tompkins is a great book. And once we start talking about the first Aero Squadron and Benjamin Fallois and the things he's done, which I think should be mandatory reading for everybody that is part of the Air Force, is right here from the Wright brothers to the astronauts. But there's also a whole bunch of other great books out there, of course. All right, so what are some of the firsts that they've done in regards to the aviation? You can read about it, as we heard earlier, here in the museum, down at the, we've moved down on the left-hand side in regards to innovation. It talks about what was being done at the Sherman Airfield over here, how it came about, talking about Benjamin Fallois, talking about Mitchell, and of course talking also about right here Hap Arnold, which of course would end up as commander of the Army Air Forces. So Camp Furlough, first Aero Squadron, so that is in Columbus, New Mexico. What came out, or what came about from the action? So the first use of the new Aero Squadron sectional organization in the military campaign, first US Army truck operations, motor transport division, first aviation field established in a military campaign, and that is what we talk about here in just a little bit. First US Army aerial reconnaissance flight over hostile territory in the military campaign. First record of 19 missions flown by squadron aircraft in one day in the military campaign. First Army prisoner of war, which was actually Captain Fallois. And you can see another picture over there laying down when he ended up in Chihuahua City on a mission, and he actually ends up as the first prisoner of war. So, and the list goes on and on. The list goes on with what Benjamin Fallois did, which by the way started as an engineer, because everything good starts as an engineer. I mean, he later went infantry, yes, and of course signal corps, and then of course he became an aviator, but you know, the basics are still the engines. So many firsts, and this is one of those slides that of course talk about the civil engineers for the Air Force, when they talk about how important it is to have the base, because of course way different thinking for the Air Force. So you saw of how we do a virtual staff flight, and I was looking for, hey, can we do a virtual staff flight cheaper than utilizing VBF3 with different resources? And what resource do I have? I had the Army Geospatial Center, since I'm part of the engineer school, and those are the gentlemen you see right over here. And I'm going to show you the software that they use. So we were trying to see if we can build a virtual staff flight just a little bit differently, but then also, since we're down there, can we find the exact location of the airfield? They had a pretty good idea, but they didn't know exactly where it is. They tried over the years with triangulations and other ways, but never really found it. So I reached out, since the Tier 1 officers that we also trained down there, I used the Skyline software, and I saw it, I was like, hey, I wonder if we can use that to build something like that. So the Army Geospatial Center out of Fort Belvoir, they sent all those gentlemen down to see if we can find the exact field. We did not find too many maps from that area. This is one of the maps, September of 1916, and that actually shows where the airfield is kind of, but not all the way, especially when you have all of those other roads which we just did not find. But if you just overlay it on Google Maps, this is what we come up with, and well, around this area, this is where they said the location would be. Plus, of course, we have a lot of pictures, but we weren't going to use those pictures too much in the beginning. So we went down there. They also have a Cheney in the museum, and once again, if you've never been down to, has anybody been to Columbus, New Mexico? If you haven't, you've been missing out. And I truly mean that, if you like that kind of history. Otherwise, pretty boring. Anyways, they also have so they have Pancho Villa State Park, and then we have also Cheney. So we met with the folks that were over there. This is actually the mayor of the village of Columbus, a really good friend now that I talk to at least every 2 weeks in regards to what's going on, of how we can help with history. And we have a couple of other gentlemen that are actually from the first Aero Squadron Foundation. They actually bought the field where the first airfield was located at, and they also did a lot of metal detecting over there. Once again, you can see there, Cheney. So we went through the information that they had. This is the former command historian of the Sergeant Major Academy. He is not around down there anymore, but if you want to have a lot of knowledge, he's one of the main guys. The other person was Richard Dean, that actually lived down there, but he passed away about 2 years ago, and he was part of the Historical Society. His grandfather was actually part of the raid, and he actually was killed during the raid. But anyways, we started talking to them to see of what all they found. So they gave us the coordinates, they gave us all the information of what they found throughout the years of metal detecting in the area. And you can see already over here with part of the software, we put this background image in that we got 1943. This airfield was continuously used, but it was changed many times. Because in the beginning, they didn't really look of where the wind was mainly coming from, building the runway. There was really no runway there, it's just the dirt field. Later on, you'll see really different ways of how to utilize the area where the airfield was. Anyways, so we have quite a few images of the area throughout the years. But here we have all of the different dots. Those were the things were found, what was found, all kinds of different stuff. Not everything belongs to an aircraft, and for sure does not belong to a Cheney or anything else that was over there. But they did a really good job of putting down the exact location where they found it, and we then put it into the software. Then they also had drones, so we started flying drones over the airfield to start getting the newest imagery that we can do. We also used some of the LiDAR, and then we need to get a helicopter because we have a great camera that they had with I don't know how many pixels, and you take thousands of pictures. Unfortunately, ARM didn't support us out of Fort Bliss, but I know a guy who knows a guy, and he's on OH6. So he came out, and I hopped on that, and we took thousands of pictures. And the way the software works is we only did it from 2 different elevations, but we chose a point on the ground, so usually a building or part of the airfield, started flying around one elevation and just kept on taking really thousands of pictures. Next elevation, going around, taking a few more thousands of pictures, and there we go. All right, so we have it right over here, the proposed, with just the overlay that we had before from the 1916 map. And then of course here we say, okay, this should be the new positions. The way we got it, we got the new model imagery, which did not help us as much as we were hoping for. And you can see it just a little bit why. But just to give you an idea, back then, when they had the hangars, they were actually just tents. So there were not structures that you really could find anything right now. There were a few structures that were built on the end, where they had the machine shop and things like that, but where the planes went in, at that time, they were pretty much just tents on the ground. And here you can see a few more pictures. It's actually the same pictures that you guys have in regards to the Sherman airfield that was over here. The same things they used. Once again, you can see over here. And like I said, they tried triangulations. They have so many pictures, but it just never worked out because they didn't know in regards to the camera lens of and the mountains. There's only a few mountains out there that you could use. So they're not really successful with that. Just want to give you an idea of how it looked like. Like I said, not much of a field there. It's just a piece of dirt. So most of them were JN3, JN4s, but they also had a few other planes that came out that they tested out there. By April of 1916, they pretty much were done with all of them. Some of them were burned in place because they were more of a hazard than anything. But once again, it was really the beginning of what we can use them for scouting, for sending messages to the field from the base camp in Columbus. This picture is kind of interesting. It's going to help us out. You can see the fence line right over here, which we'll see later on in just a bit. Here you have a great picture. Another first is what they used, the photography of flying over and actually using what can they use for reconnaissance purposes. But this picture for us to find out where exactly the airfield is doesn't do us any good because there are no real marks, no real streets, no railroad that was coming across, and nothing like that. But what we were able to use is that picture from 1943 that I talked about earlier, we got from the National Archives, along with the picture that I just showed you. So you see the slight bend right over here, which goes back to the picture I showed you earlier of the planes with the fence line. Now we have this picture, and we can actually put this because we have this bend. We also have the direction of drainage, which really doesn't change, and we can put it right over here. Now to make sure that this is actually not just, let's put the plug, just throw it in there until it fits. Let's make sure this all works. How big were those planes back then? So how big would be the area from one of those tents? And now we have the software, we can actually start seeing, okay, how big was that? Yes, that fits. It is not out of proportion, it truly fits. So we know it is in proportion, and we know we have this road as well as the drainage. Now we start putting the things in that they all found, and now we have most of the things, or many of the things that they found, right around the little hangars, as well as some of the other structures. Because we have another cluster of aircraft items over there. Why do we have that? Well, we came up with, there was one archaeologist actually on the team as well. He came up with, well, what kind of buildings were over there? Those were actually hardwood floor, so if things fall down, you would find more of those items. And you can just see propeller manufacturing, for example, which was a big problem for them because of all the heat down there. Not easy to keep all of those machines going. Alright, so now I'm going to show you really quick the actual software that we used and the Alright, this is beautiful Columbus, New Mexico. So Highway 9, Highway 11, 3 miles from the border, like I said. And now we start going in, and now we see this terrain. This is actually the museum that was just at. And now we can actually, go around and start moving. And we could probably use that. Not as good as VBF3 if this terrain we saw before, but a much cheaper version and much quicker version of conducting a virtual staff ride. That's Coots Hill. So you can see, I mean, you can go behind Coots Hill, so you don't see the town anymore. You can have other features in, like putting extra pictures in there. You could put some of the older pictures in there from the time period. There's only a few structures that survived. This is the train depot. Over here is the gazebo, which was of course rebuilt. This is what Pershing would be when the troops returned back in February of 1917. This right over here is the border station that is still from this area. Next, we have the Hoover Hotel. This is where the main defensive line or the Castleman line would end up. Like I said, I'm not going to give you all the answers. You guys have to research later on, right? I'm just going to show you a few things. So this is where the main of the fighting was happening really once the U.S. forces would do their blocking, which by the way, this is the bank right over here, the water's left over. And like I said, it's the Hoover Hotel. And you can go around and check that out. And just last year in November is when the village of Columbus actually bought this Hoover Hotel, because I was a historian the previous March there that said, hey, let's take a look at that and check it out. And they actually bought it now, so it's all about the preservation, right? And then we got another building over here, which is the schoolhouse. That is where most of the people that lived in Columbus at the time actually went to after the raid, because everybody thought the Punch Revere would come back. And of course here we now have, when we talk about the airfield, 1943 picture. And we have all the dots coming up. It's just once again the explanation, and with that software we can actually go in of what all they found. We could actually look at those kind of things as well. All right. Future projects. We now work with Construction Survey Technologies Incorporated. They are more than happy because they are all about history, and one of the learning objectives here is the whole relationship building. Well, guess what? That's exactly what I do every time I go down there. They actually were part of the History Channel when they went beyond Oak Island. I'm not really watching Beyond Oak Island, but if you've seen it in El Paso, Pancho Villa Stash House, that aired back in March of this year, they were actually the ones that helped out to see what they can find underneath it. And they will probably use a LiDAR and some other stuff that they have to see what we can find in regards to the entire area west of Columbus. That is where it was really built up. We're getting a plan of seeing what's all still out there and maybe helping with some of the visualization that we want to do. Hoover Hotel, I kind of talked about that. So every time I'm down there, I'm helping them out, the mayor, so that's clearly not what my main job is, but since I love it so much, I'm also part of a civil affairs officer, PSYOPs, and everything else that you can possibly do to help them out. Economic development, historic preservation, the digitalization. Once again, the company I just talked about, they are supposed to come in and do all of that for free for the village of Columbus to really preserve the history that's over there. We're talking about maybe doing a documentary. I've been talking to the one Air Force Squadron commander that just started the Air Force Academy to start getting the Air Force Academy more involved, because that is truly where the history begins, right? This first airfield going into combat, not World War I in foreign lands, no, right there. It's not that far from Colorado, so we try to get them more involved in this as well. And like I said, I've been down to like Battle of El Carrizal, where the Buffalo soldiers were fighting the federal Mexican army, so against Carranza's troops, June 21, 1916. But I want to really go the rest of the Punitive expedition of really the trail. There's so many places that are still exactly the same. You can still find different things. So with finally taking the pictures and then hopefully getting virtual training. And then another thing we really want to do is a deep dive in those relationships and those connections I talked about earlier to really, get more proof of, hey, what happened there truly matters. It matters for what happens later on in World War I and World War II. If you go through the gallery, one of the pictures that you see on the one map is a Punch Revere standing there with Pershing, and beside it you see a lieutenant. 9 out of 10 books always talk about that's General Patton, or back then Lieutenant Patton. Not true, it's Lieutenant Collins. Lieutenant Collins would become later Major General Collins in World War II, and of course we all know how Patton ends up. So, and many more of those folks with relationships that you can see. All right. What kind of questions do I have?
Are the Mexicans interested in any way in learning more about this work on their side of the border?
Yes, and that's actually somebody else that I work with. Cindy Medina, she used to work for the Punch Revere Stash House in El Paso, but now she works for the Punch Revere Foundation. Next year it's going to be 100 years when Punch Revere was assassinated, so it's going to be a really big deal. And yes, we are working together. Every year there's also the Cabalgata in Columbus, which is the second weekend of March, which is the biggest party you can possibly have in a small border town like that. They have about 100 riders coming in. Those riders actually go from Corral all the way up to the border, and I mean they truly have a party non-stop for those 14 plus days. But then again, being on the saddle for 14 days through that terrain, maybe that would be pretty thirsty too. But anyways, so they do a lot of that stuff. And Cindy Medina, as well as the Punch Revere Foundation, they work more and more, and I've started working with those guys more as well. So they're interested as well in that part of history. That's another thing that I want to make sure that we don't just get one story. But of course, it's problematic because when I went to Carousel, for example, you start talking to some folks and they tell you about, this is where General Pershing died in this battle. Like, really? I don't think so. But once again, the regional myth and so on and so forth. What else do I have?
Well, you mentioned that there was an archaeologist with y'all. Did y'all actually need to do any archaeological excavations, or did you just use the metal detector?
Metal detector and then the UAV stuff and all the pictures, that's all we did. And he was then kind of like, okay, this should be at least 85-90% certainty that this is how it was. They had ground penetrating radar as well, which we couldn't really use that much for this. We will use that when we start looking maybe at some of the Hoover Hotel, if you find anything underneath it. But yeah, for that mission, we didn't really do that too much. They were there, I think, for 5 days. So yeah, we could have used more time, but it was a training mission for them. So yeah.
How many aircraft were on site?
There were only about 8 in the beginning, and like I said, the other ones that came in. So, and they started losing those aircraft rather quickly, right? When they started taking off, they start taking off at night on the first day, and most of those aircraft doesn't even make it to the place where they're supposed to go. They're supposed to meet up with General Pershing in the Casa Grande area, so they have no real navigation, there's no real maps, nor could you really use that too much. They just know, hey, we're going to fly south and we're going to start looking for bonfires. And of course, the whole communication wasn't that great either. So you get people just landing wherever they could land. One guy had to return right away, so it was a mess. So that part, yes, wasn't very, very successful. And then you can have a great discussion about the leadership from for war, of the way we're going to do it, and off they go at night. But yeah, like I said, by April, mid-April, I think they have 2 of the original aircraft left, and they actually start burning those because they were truly,
Trash.
rather hazardous, yes. But from that there came all the improvement too, of what we have to look at. I mean, they were very underpowered, for this area of being that high of elevation, the winds and so on and so forth. There's a lot of innovation that was going on, not just in the aviation. So.
Were there any other air operations other than out of Columbus? I said they're going to fly from here to El Paso and somebody's going to meet somebody. Did the Army have other aviation assets along the border?
It was just the first Aero Squadron. So they were sent down to San Antonio before that, and that's where they actually came from after the raid. On trains, they made it to Columbus, start putting the planes together, and then start test flying and start flying around in the area first, and then they started flying down once the ground forces reached Carlos Columbus. And then what they really used them for is they had a couple of different spots of really just courier messages and stuff like that, and bringing mail and things like that. Anything else?
So how effective were they effective at all? I mean, obviously, the military can learn even when they aren't very effective. But did they do anything good?
You talk about the planes?
Yeah, the squadron.
They helped with the communication aspect. They never found. They were spotting. They were landing right in place next to them. Like, hey, here you are. Maybe one of the other. Because once again, it was the cavalry that was going out and really searching of, hey, where can we find Pancho Villa and part of this band of, because they were not just going after Pancho Villa, going after the band. So they were doing that kind of reconnaissance and then going straight to the ground and giving them the idea of, hey, next valley over, you have another cavalry squadron looking this way, things like that. But that's about it.
And were there any key lessons that they, like over the course of this interaction, were they like, okay, we started off doing it this way, and then by the end, they're doing it a different way?
So the main thing was really they were fighting of getting better equipment, of the better planes. But if you start reading part of just the experience of Benjamin Faurois, of what he had in regards to, that's why I had the one quote in there from General Arnold talking about the airfield. You can see that, and many times they start talking about that in World War II, about the importance of the airfield, the importance for the civil engineers. But you can already see that even before with some of the writing that Faurois had. But that's about it. But what came afterwards, he was such an advocate for the. Of course, it was him and Mitchell. You see that if you go to the museum of how they were, butting heads the entire time. And how many people heard of Faurois? Not that many. How many people heard of Mitchell? A few more. I mean, just there's a plane named after him. But the work that he's done, once again, if you read that book, you will see of the groundwork that he laid to get the Air Force started. So, from the experience that he had during the Punitive expedition, then he was chosen together with Pershing. Once again, that experience I talked about, the relationships I talked about. Pershing wanted Faurois with him, so when he went to France, it was Faurois with him, giving him the advice and working with him of advancing the air arm of the army at that point. Anything else? Like I said, now you guys have to go out and do the research, because I didn't give you that many answers. Hopefully it gives you some interest in the subject. It is really important, and there's a lot of things that can be learned. And when you do conduct, staff fight, virtual staff fight, some of the insight I talked about, those are the things we talk about to really go ahead for the future, to make a better soldier, make a better army, and be prepared for the next war. Unfortunately. So please go, check out the gallery, and don't forget the gift shop. Because they have little planes that, yeah.
Thank you.
One last thing, I'm sorry, I found an absolutely fascinating online thing, it's called Bastion on the Border Fort Bliss, which doesn't show up in a lot of searches, but it covers a lot of this in a very nice background way, and it kind of, the key points that you mentioned were covered in there, and that's online, you don't even have to buy a book.
Absolutely.
That was 93. So I'm sorry.
That's good.
Thank you.
Right.